Emmanuel Todd sits frozen in the grainy black and white of an old archival photograph, looking less like a prophet of doom and more like a weary graduate student buried under the weight of his own research. His hair is unkempt, a chaotic halo typical of the Parisian intellectual set in the mid-70s, but it is his eyes that command attention, sharp, skeptical, and fixed on something invisible to the camera lens. He is just 25 years old in this moment, a mere boy in the eyes of the establishment, yet behind that unassuming, almost fragile gaze lies a mind that is about to dismantle the greatest geopolitical illusion of the 20th century. He does not look like a man who is holding the detonator to a historical bomb. But the papers scattered on the desk before him contain a secret that the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth have completely missed. To understand the magnitude of what he saw, you must first step into the suffocating atmosphere of 1976, a time when the Cold War felt like a permanent condition of human existence. The world was frozen in a deadlock of terror, divided by an iron curtain that seemed as eternal as the mountains. In the West, the Soviet Union was perceived as a terrifying monolith of steel and nuclear fire, a scientifically managed society that marched in perfect lockstep toward a communist future. But deep within the quiet, dusty stacks of a university library, Todd was looking at numbers that whispered a different story. He was not reading the speeches of general secretaries or the propaganda reports of 5-year plans. He was studying the dry, boring columns of demographic yearbooks. And there, amidst the rows of forgotten data, he found a glitch in the matrix, a tiny, tragic anomaly that the Kremlin censors had failed to scrub away. The statistic was infant mortality, and it was behaving in a way that defied the laws of the modern world. In every developed nation on Earth, from the United States to Japan, the curve of history bent in one direction. Medicine improved, hygiene advanced, and fewer children died. It was the fundamental promise of progress, the unspoken contract between a state and its people. But in the Soviet Union, the line had curled violently upward. Russian babies were dying at rates that belonged to the previous century, succumbing to preventable infections and systemic neglect. This was not merely a failure of rural health care. It was a biological signal of a civilization in total, unrecoverable collapse. Todd realized that a society that cannot keep its own children alive is a society that has already ceased to function, regardless of how many intercontinental ballistic missiles it parades through Red Square. The tension of this discovery lay in its absolute isolation from the accepted reality of the era. Imagine the sheer vertigo of possessing a truth that contradicts the entire geopolitical narrative of your time. The Central Intelligence Agency, with its billion-dollar budgets and networks of spies, saw a Soviet Union that was growing stronger, a formidable economic rival that required massive military spending to contain. Todd saw a rotting corpse propped up by fear and inertia. He understood that the Soviet system had exhausted its moral and physical reserves, that the new Soviet man was not conquering the stars, but was instead drowning in vodka and despair. The West was arming itself against a giant, unaware that the giant was already suffering from terminal organ failure. It was a conspiracy of blindness, where the fear of the enemy was so necessary for the West's own identity that no one dared to look closely at the cracks in the enemy's armor. Demography is the most ruthless of all sciences because it cannot be bribed, intimidated, or silenced by secret police. You can fake a harvest report to please the party secretary. You can exaggerate steel production to terrify the Americans. And you can lie about the happiness of the proletariat in the newspapers. But you cannot hide the dead. The death of a child is a distinct, undeniable fact that ripples through the social fabric, leaving scars that no amount of propaganda can cover. Todd treated these statistics like an archaeologist brushing away dust from a skeleton. He was reconstructing the reality of Soviet life from the bottom up. He saw the alcoholism, the broken families, the sheer exhaustion of a people who had stopped believing in their own future. He predicted the collapse of the USSR not through mystical intuition or political bias, but through the brutal, cold honesty of death statistics. When he finally published his findings in a book titled The Final Fall, the reaction from the establishment was a mixture of polite amusement and aggressive dismissal. Who was this arrogant young historian to question the consensus of the world's finest strategic minds? The experts scoffed. The Soviets banned his name from ever being spoken in their territories, and the West continued its expensive dance of deterrence, entirely blind to the reality that their adversary was committing slow suicide. It is a chilling reminder of how blinding the official narrative can be. We prefer the comfortable lie of a powerful enemy to the unsettling chaos of a crumbling one. Todd was treated as a fantasist, a provocateur throwing stones at a fortress that looked impenetrable from the outside. Yet he sat back with the patience of a man who knows that mathematics does not lie. But history, as it always does, has a dark and twisted sense of humor. The numbers sat there in the archives, ticking like a silent time bomb, waiting for the moment when reality would finally catch up to the math. Todd went on with his life, watching and waiting, knowing that the collapse was not a possibility, but a mathematical certainty written in the graveyards of Russia. The tragedy was not just that the Soviet Union would fall, but that the West would be entirely unprepared for the deafening silence that would follow. As we look back at that young man in the photo, a deeper, more unsettling question begins to form in the shadows. If he could see the death of one superpower when everyone else was blind, identifying the subtle toxins in the blood of the state, what is he seeing now when he turns that same magnifying glass upon us? The archives are open again, and the numbers are starting to speak. It is difficult to overstate the magnitude of the intelligence failure that defined the late 1970s. While Emmanuel Todd was tracing the grim curves of infant mortality in a quiet library, the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in human history was staring directly at the Soviet Union and seeing nothing but a phantom. The Central Intelligence Agency, MI6, and the vast labyrinth of Western security services were obsessed with counting tanks. They possessed satellite imagery that could read a license plate in Vladivostok. They had listening posts in Turkey recording the whispers of Red Army generals, and they had mountains of economic data processed by the most powerful computers of the age. Yet, in a twist that feels almost literary in its irony, they missed the death rattle of the very beast they were hunting. They were so fixated on the muscle of the bear, the steel tonnage, the missile silos, the submarine fleets, that they failed to notice the heart had stopped beating. This collective blindness was not an accident. It was a systemic necessity, a conspiracy of competence where the experts agreed to ignore reality in favor of job security. The Cold War had become a lucrative industry, a self-perpetuating machine that required a terrifying enemy to function. If the Soviet Union was crumbling, if it was actually a pathetic giant with clay feet, then the justification for trillion-dollar defense budgets would evaporate overnight. The generals in the Pentagon and the spy masters in Langley needed the Kremlin to be formidable. They needed the threat to be existential. So, consciously or subconsciously, they filtered the intelligence. They polished the reports. They emphasized the strength and buried the weakness, creating a feedback loop where the West was arming itself against a nightmare of its own invention. It was a symbiotic relationship. The Soviet lie of strength was sustained by the Western desire to believe it. When Todd's analysis landed on the desks of these intelligence professionals, it was treated with the condescending smirk of high priesthood dismissing a heretic. Here was a 25-year-old French academic armed with nothing but public health statistics and a demographic intuition, telling the masters of the universe that they were wrong. The reaction was not just skepticism. It was a deep structural rejection. To accept Todd's thesis meant admitting that decades of strategy, espionage, and diplomatic posturing had been based on a fundamental error. It meant admitting that the CIA could not distinguish between a superpower and a hospice patient. So the report was filed away in the deep archives, likely unread by the decision-makers who mattered, buried under the weight of classified briefs that confidently predicted Soviet dominance well into the 21st century. The arrogance of the establishment is always most brittle right before it shatters. The spies were looking for secrets, but the truth was hiding in the open, in the banality of everyday life that intelligence agencies deem beneath their notice. They were counting warheads, but they should have been counting coffins. They should have been looking at the lines of exhausted women waiting for bread, the rust eating away at the factory gears, and the quiet despair in the eyes of the Soviet youth. Todd understood that the strength of a nation is not measured in throw weight or armored divisions, but in the desire of its people to reproduce, to live, and to build the future. The spies, trapped in their windowless rooms and echo chambers, had forgotten that nations are made of people, and when the people lose the will to survive, the state is nothing more than a hollow shell waiting for a strong wind to knock it over. There is a particular kind of dread that comes from watching a car crash in slow motion while the driver insists he is in perfect control. That is what the late 70s and early 80s felt like for the few who actually saw the cracks. The West ramped up the pressure, deploying Pershing missiles and talking of Star Wars, convinced they were wrestling a dragon. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership was becoming a gerontocracy of walking corpses, men kept alive by potent drugs and sheer stubbornness, mirroring the decay of the empire they ruled. The disconnect between the official intelligence reports and the biological reality on the ground was becoming grotesque. The West was preparing for World War III against an enemy that was struggling to manufacture decent shoes. It was a theater of the absurd, played out with nuclear weapons, where the only man who knew the script was ending was a historian nobody wanted to listen to. This refusal to see the cliff edge until the fall has already begun is the recurring nightmare of all great powers. It suggests that the institutions designed to protect us are actually designed to blind us. to keep us comfortable in our anxieties rather than facing the disruptive truth. The intelligence community had built a cathedral of analysis around the Soviet threat, and they were not about to let a few inconvenient birth rates tear it down. They ignored the rot because the rot was boring, unsexy, and didn't require new spy satellites to monitor. They preferred the grand narrative of the clash of civilizations to the quiet, sad story of a society drinking itself to death. In doing so, they ensured that when the collapse finally came, it would hit the West not as a victory, but as a chaotic, confusing shock that would leave the victors scrambling to understand a world they had completely misread. The tragedy of Cassandra is not that she can see the future, but that no one believes her until the walls are burning. Todd was the Cassandra of the Cold War, pointing at the crumbling foundations while the architects assured everyone the building was sound. His isolation during these years serves as a chilling warning for our own time. It forces us to ask, what are the current truths that are too big to question? What are the modern equivalents of the Soviet tank divisions that we are obsessively counting, while the real indicators of doom are buried in a spreadsheet that no one bothers to open? The blindness of the spies was not a momentary lapse. It was a feature of the system. And as the gears of history continued to grind toward 1991, that system remained blissfully, dangerously asleep, dreaming of a war that would never happen, while the real apocalypse crept in through the back door of a maternity ward. The winter of 1991 did not just bring snow to Moscow. It brought the end of a world. When the hammer and sickle was lowered from the flagpole above the Kremlin for the final time, the silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a superpower vanishing into the thin, cold air of history, leaving behind a bewildered population and a stunned global audience. In Washington, London, and Paris, the mood was one of euphoric disbelief. The experts scrambled to explain how the invincible adversary had dissolved so rapidly, grasping for narratives about economic pressure, military spending, and diplomatic genius. But in a quiet study in France, Emmanuel Todd watched the news with the heavy, unsmiling expression of a man who had read the final page of the book 15 years before anyone else had even opened the cover. There is no joy in this kind of vindication, only a profound and unsettling sense of alienation. To be right when the entire world is wrong is to be separated from the collective reality of your species. For Todd, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not a surprise twist. It was the inevitable result of a mathematical equation finally balancing itself out. He didn't feel the triumphant rush of a gambler who hits the jackpot. He felt the somber validation of a doctor who diagnoses a terminal illness that everyone else dismisses as a common cold, only to watch the patient die exactly as predicted. The vindication was hollow because it confirmed a terrifying truth. The people in charge, the grand strategists and the political titans, were surfing on the surface of waves they didn't understand, while the deep currents of anthropology and demography determined the ship's course. The world wanted to believe that the West had won a great ideological victory, that freedom had triumphed over tyranny through the sheer force of moral superiority. Todd knew better. He knew that the Soviet Union had not been defeated by Reagan's speeches or the allure of blue jeans. It had been defeated by its own internal decay, by the collapse of the family structure, and by the profound despair that had taken root in the soul of the Russian people. The wall didn't fall because of external pressure. It fell because the mortar holding it together had turned to dust decades ago. This perspective stripped the West of its heroic narrative. It suggested that history is not a battle of wills, but a biological process, a slow accumulation of birth rates, death rates, and literacy statistics that grind empires into oblivion regardless of who sits on the throne. As the 90s dawned and the end of history was proclaimed with great fanfare, Todd remained an outsider to the celebration. He became a prophet of the past, a man whose crystal ball was a mirror reflecting the hidden fractures of society. The media briefly turned its attention to him, marveling at his lucky guess, but they missed the point entirely. They treated his prediction as a fluke, a singular event, rather than proof of a rigorous scientific method. They failed to see that the mechanism Todd had used, the analysis of moral and demographic decay, was not a tool designed solely for the Soviet experiment. It was a universal diagnostic instrument, still humming quietly in the background, waiting to be pointed at a new target. The machine had not stopped. It was merely idling, hungry for fresh data. There is something ghostly about the way old empires die. They do not explode, they implode. The energy turns inward, consuming the host until nothing is left but a shell. Todd had watched this process consume the East, tracing the lines of suicide and alcoholism that served as the grim vital signs of a dying state. Now, as the West danced on the grave of communism, he began to wonder if the victors were immune to the same sickness. The Vindication of 1991 was a warning, not a conclusion. It proved that the surface appearance of power is an illusion, that a nation can possess thousands of nuclear warheads and still be rotting from the inside out. The Soviet Union had been a zombie for years before it fell, walking and talking while dead, and Todd was the only one who had smelled the necrosis. This realization brings with it a creeping sense of dread. If the signs of collapse are so subtle, so easily hidden behind GDP figures and military parades, could they be present elsewhere? The fall of the USSR proved that the unthinkable is merely the inevitable waiting to happen. It shattered the myth of permanence. Governments, borders, and ideologies are fragile constructs that float on the deep, dark ocean of human behavior. When the family breaks, when the will to live fades, the state follows. Todd's silence in the face of the Western victory lap was the silence of a man listening for the next cracking sound in the floorboards. The Soviet chapter was closed, but the laws of history that killed it were still in effect, impartial and ruthless, looking for the next weak structure to dismantle. The euphoria of the 90s was a drug, a potent mix of arrogance and relief that blinded the West once again. They believed they had solved the riddle of human governance, that liberal democracy was the final destination of the species. Todd saw it differently. He saw a world that had lost its counterweight, a unipolar moment that would breed hubris and blindness. The vindication of his work on the Soviet Union was not the end of his journey. It was the proof of concept for a terrifying new hypothesis. The tools that had dissected the corpse of communism were now sharp and ready, And as the dust settled over the ruins of the Berlin Wall, Emmanuel Todd began to turn his gaze away from the east and toward the setting sun. The diagnostic machine was about to be turned on the victors. The turn of the millennium was a time of blinding golden arrogance. The West had declared victory not just over a rival superpower, but over time itself. The end of history became the secular gospel of the age, preaching that liberal democracy and free market capitalism were the final perfect forms of human society. The skyscrapers of New York and the parliaments of Europe stood as monuments to an eternal present, unassailable and supreme.
But in the shadows of this glittering triumph, Emmanuel Todd was quietly adjusting his lens. The man who had diagnosed the terminal cancer of the Soviet Union did not retire. He merely switched patients. With the cold, clinical detachment of a coroner, he began to apply the exact same diagnostic tools to the victors that he had once used on the vanquished. And what he saw in the petri dish of Western civilization made the blood run cold. It started with the same subtle, terrifying glitches in the data. He looked past the soaring stock markets and the confident speeches of presidents, focusing instead on the biological reality of the population. He saw mortality rates in the United States beginning to creep upward, a phenomenon that should be impossible in the richest nation on earth. He saw the stagnation of educational attainment, the plateauing of literacy, and the fracturing of the nuclear family. These were the classic symptoms of the Soviet sickness, the distinct markers of a society that is beginning to consume itself. It was as if a ghost had crossed the Atlantic, carrying the same viral load of decay that had rotted the Kremlin from the inside out. The West was not immune. It was merely the next host. The suspense in this realization lies in the horrifying symmetry of it all. The very flaws that the West had mocked in the Soviets, the corruption, the inefficiency, the loss of faith in the future, were now blooming in the suburbs of America and the industrial heartlands of Europe. Todd watched as the suicide rates climbed, driven by a despair that mirrored the vodka-soaked nihilism of the late Soviet period. He saw a political class that was increasingly detached from the reality of its citizens, living in a bubble of wealth and privilege while the infrastructure crumbled around them. The end of history was not a permanent paradise. It was a delusion that masked the onset of a new, slow-motion collapse.
The hunter had become the prey, stalked by the same relentless forces of anthropological decline. This was not a sudden explosion, but a gradual creeping rot. Todd observed the rise of deaths of despair, drug overdoses, alcohol-related liver disease, and suicides decimating the working class of the United States. He saw a university system that was producing fewer engineers and more debt-ridden serfs. He saw a social fabric tearing apart at the seams, polarized by a political system that had ceased to solve problems and existed only to perpetuate its own power. To Todd, these were not isolated political issues. They were the vital signs of a dying organism. The American empire was following the Soviet script with terrifying precision, walking the same path toward irrelevance, guided by the same blindness that had destroyed its rival. The world refused to see it, of course. The narrative of Western supremacy was too strong, too comforting to abandon. Just as the CIA had ignored the rising infant mortality in the USSR, the Western elites ignored the rotting foundations of their own house. They pointed to the GDP, the tech giants, and the military bases that dotted the globe as proof of their enduring strength. But Todd knew that these were lagging indicators. A tree can look majestic and strong for years after its roots have died, standing tall until the first strong wind topples it over. He was watching the roots die, documenting the nutrient starvation of a culture that had forgotten how to nurture its own people. There is a profound irony in watching a civilization celebrate its victory while it is already terminally ill. Todd's work during this period took on the quality of a noir thriller, where the detective realizes that the killer is inside the house. He was no longer looking at a foreign enemy. He was looking at the breakdown of the very civilization that had birthed him. The Sovietization of the West was not an ideological conquest, but a structural convergence. The West was becoming rigid, dogmatic, and incapable of self-correction. The free press was becoming a monolithic echo chamber. The dynamic economy was turning into a rent-seeking oligarchy. The symptoms were all there, printed in the statistical yearbooks, screaming silently for anyone brave enough to read them. As the 21st century progressed, the cracks became impossible to hide, even for the most devoted believers. The financial crash, the political populism, the social unrest, these were the convulsions of a system in distress. But Todd had seen it coming decades earlier in the quiet columns of numbers that predicted the future. He understood that the West had not won the Cold War, it had merely survived it, and now the adrenaline had worn off. The exhaustion was setting in. The end of history was a lie. History was back, and it was hungry. The lens that had once exposed the frailty of the East was now focused mercilessly on the West, revealing a picture of a civilization that was sliding toward the same abyss, sleepwalking into a nightmare of its own making. The diagnosis deepens, moving from the physical symptoms of decay to the spiritual autopsy of a civilization. Emmanuel Todd peels back the skin of the West to reveal the hollow space where its heart used to be. He argues that the colossal power of the Anglo-American world was never just about geography or economics. It was built on a specific, potent software, the Protestant matrix. This was the invisible engine of the West, a culture obsessed with literacy, driven by a neurotic work ethic, and grounded in a rigid but effective family structure. It was a system that demanded every individual read the Bible for themselves, inadvertently creating the most literate and productive workforce in human history. But now, Todd whispers the unsettling truth. The engine is dead. The ghost has left the machine, and we are merely coasting on the momentum of the past. This is the concept of the zombie category, a sociological term that feels like a line from a horror movie. A zombie category is a cultural reflex that persists long after the belief system that created it has died. We still act like Protestants. We value work. We obsess over individual achievement. We maintain the rituals of liberal democracy. But the spiritual core that gave these actions meaning has evaporated. The churches are empty, the Bible is unread, and the metaphysical certainty that once anchored the Western soul has been replaced by a vacuum. The West is running on fumes, a civilization performing the pantomime of its ancestors without understanding the script. It is a shell without a ghost, a temple where the idols have crumbled, but the priests still demand sacrifices. The danger of this spiritual death is not just theological, it is existential. A society without a metaphysical core is vulnerable to a terrifying form of nihilism. When the old gods die and nothing replaces them, the social contract begins to dissolve. The shared values that held the community together, the unspoken rules of decency, duty, and trust, start to fray. Todd argues that this zero state of religion is the root cause of the West's current paralysis. We have become a collection of atomized individuals drifting in a moral void, unable to unite for any common purpose because we no longer share a common language of meaning. The Protestant ethic has mutated into a grotesque parody of itself. Greed without purpose, ambition without responsibility, and freedom without constraint. There is a conspiracy of silence around this void. We pretend that secular liberalism is a self-sustaining perpetual motion machine capable of generating its own morality. But Todd suggests that liberalism was merely the afterglow of Protestantism, a secular fruit growing on a religious tree. Now that the roots are dead, the fruit is rotting. We see this in the sudden, catastrophic collapse of social cohesion. The rise of identity politics, the explosion of mental illness, the frantic search for new identities. These are the desperate, thrashing motions of a culture trying to find a new anchor in a storm. Without the stabilizing force of the old matrix, the West has become emotionally and psychologically fragile, prone to hysteria and sudden, irrational shifts in direction. This part of the narrative feels like walking through an abandoned cathedral. The architecture is still magnificent, the stained glass still catches the light, but the air is stale and the pews are covered in dust. We are living in the ruins of our own history, pretending that the roof isn't leaking. Todd's analysis strips away the illusion of progress, revealing that what we call modernization might actually be a form of regression. We are shedding the complex social structures that knew us strong and reverting to a more primitive, chaotic state. The discipline that built the skyscrapers and the fleets is gone, replaced by a culture of instant gratification and profound loneliness. The Protestant ghost is a haunting metaphor for the vulnerability of the West. It explains why the most powerful nations on earth feel so weak, so unsure of themselves. We are fighting enemies who still believe in something, whether it is nationalism, religion, or historical destiny, while we believe in nothing for our own comfort. And as history has shown time and again, a culture that believes in nothing, with it's conquered by a culture that believes in something. Todd warns that the zombie stage cannot last forever. Eventually, the body decomposes. The collapse of the spiritual core inevitably leads to the collapse of the physical structures, the economy, the living, and the state itself. We are watching the slow death of the soul of the West. And the question is not if the body will follow, but when. We move now from the spiritual void to the economic hallucination. In the gleaming boardrooms of New York and London, the West convinces itself of its omnipotence by staring at a single mesmerizing number: gross domestic product. It is the holy grail of modern economics, the ultimate scorecard of nations. According to this metric, the West is a titan, dwarfing its rivals with an economy so vast it defies comprehension. But Emmanuel Todd looks at these numbers and sees a mirage. He peels back the layers of financial abstraction to reveal a terrifying discrepancy that the war in Ukraine laid bare for all to see. The emperor has no clothes and, more importantly, the emperor has no artillery shells. The revelation hits with the force of a physical blow. How is it possible that the United States, with a GDP supposedly 20 times larger than Russia's, cannot manufacture enough simple 155mm shells to sustain a proxy war? The answer lies in the illusion of the service economy. Todd argues that the West has been running a gigantic Ponzi scheme of value, counting inflated healthcare costs, legal fees, and financial speculation as production. We have built an economy of lawyers, consultants, and marketing executives, people who move money around but create nothing tangible. Meanwhile, Russia, with an economy dismissed as a gas station with nukes, is outproducing the entire collective West in the things that actually matter when the shooting starts: steel, wheat, energy, and munitions. This is the difference between fictitious capital and real economy. It is the difference between a stock market valuation and a factory floor. Todd forces us to question the very nature of wealth. Is a country rich because its real estate prices are skyrocketing and its tech companies are trading at insane multiples? Or is a country rich because it can feed its people, heat its homes, and arm its soldiers without begging for help? The West has confused the map with the territory, believing that the numbers in a bank computer are more real than the physical resources in the ground. We have financialized our existence to the point where we have forgotten how to make things. The suspense builds as we realize the strategic implications of this delusion. We are like a poker player betting the house on a pair of twos, convinced we have a royal flush because our chips are made of gold. But when the cards are turned over, the gold chips don't matter. Only the hand does. The conflict in Ukraine served as a brutal stress test for the Western economic model, and the model failed. The sanctions that were supposed to crush the ruble and destroy the Russian economy bounced off like bullets hitting a tank. Why? Because you cannot sanction real resources with virtual money. You cannot eat Bitcoin, and you cannot shoot a derivatives contract. Russia held the hard assets, the oil, the gas, the grain, the titanium, while the West held the ledger entries. This part of the story feels like waking up from a fever dream. We look around at our advanced economies and see the hollowness. We see supply chains that break at the slightest pressure, power grids that fail in winter, and a defense industrial base that has atrophied into irrelevance. We have outsourced our survival to the lowest bidder, dismantling our own capacity to produce in the name of efficiency and profit. Todd paints a picture of a civilization that has lobotomized itself, cutting out the parts of the brain responsible for physical reality in favor of a dopamine-fueled fantasy of eternal consumption. The contrast is stark and unsettling. On one side, the backward East, churning out tanks and missiles with the grim efficiency of the 20th century. On the other, the advanced West, struggling to ramp up production of basic ammunition because its factories were turned into loft apartments decades ago. It is a conspiracy of complacency, a belief that money can solve any problem, even the laws of physics. But money is just a claim on resources, and if you don't control the resources, your money is worthless paper. Todd's analysis turns the world upside down. The poor are rich, and the rich are poor. The West is a bloated giant, heavy with debt and delusion, while the East is lean, hungry, and armed with the hard tools of survival. The illusion of GDP has shattered, and through the cracks, we can see the cold, hard reality of the New World Order staring back at us. The tragedy of Ukraine, in Emmanuel Todd's view, is not a story of heroic resistance or villainous aggression, but a bleak noir tale of an empire stepping into its own bear trap. The official narrative tells us that this war was a surprise attack by a madman, a bolt from the blue that shattered the peace of Europe. But Todd flips the script, presenting the conflict as the inevitable climax of Western hubris, a desperate gamble by a declining superpower trying to reassert its dominance and failing spectacularly. The United States, he argues, did not stumble into this war. It courted it, nurtured it, and ultimately trapped itself within it. Washington believed it was setting a snare for the Russian bear, hoping to bleed it dry and isolate it from the world. Instead, the snare snapped shut on the hunter's own leg. The miscalculation was colossal, born of the same arrogance that had blinded the West to its own internal rot. The master strategists in the Pentagon and the State Department operated on a model of reality that was 20 years out of date. They believed that the mere threat of American displeasure would cause the Russian economy to implode. They thought that sanctions would trigger a palace coup in the Kremlin and that the Russian people, starving for iPhones and McDonald's, would rise up in revolt. It was a fantasy based on a profound misunderstanding of the Russian social fabric. Just as they had once overestimated the strength of the Soviet Union, they now underestimated the resilience of Russia. They failed to see that the harsh years of the 90s had inoculated the Russian population against hardship. They didn't understand that for a people who had survived the collapse of their world once already, the loss of luxury goods was an annoyance, not an existential crisis. But the trap was not just economic. It was industrial. By forcing a conventional land war in Europe, the United States inadvertently agreed to a test that it was physically incapable of passing. The war in Ukraine became a duel of artillery, a grinding contest of attrition that consumes steel and explosives at a rate not seen since the Second World War. And here, the illusion of Western omnipotence shattered against the hard rocks of reality. The arsenal of democracy was empty. The West discovered, to its horror, that it could not produce enough shells, enough barrels, enough tanks to keep pace with the Russian war machine. The terrifying irony is that by trying to weaken Russia, the West revealed its own impotence to the entire world. Every delayed shipment, every plea for ammunition, every admission of depleted stockpiles was a signal to Beijing, Tehran, and Delhi that the emperor was naked. The geopolitical consequences were even more catastrophic. The plan was to isolate Russia, to turn it into a pariah state cut off from the global community. But Todd points to the map and asks, who is actually isolated? The sanctions regime, intended to be a global wall, turned out to be a picket fence around the West itself. The vast majority of the world, the global South, the emerging economies, the nations that actually produce the resources humanity needs, refused to join the crusade. They looked at the conflict and saw not a moral struggle, but a colonial power trying to dictate terms to a sovereign state. Instead of pushing Russia into a corner, the West pushed the rest of the world into Russia's arms. The trap had sprung, but the prey was not inside. This section of the story is suffused with the melancholy of a grand master who realizes he has lost the game 10 moves before the checkmate. The war in Ukraine was meant to be the reaffirmation of American hegemony, a demonstration of power that would bring the world to heel. Instead, it became the accelerator of its decline. It exposed the hollowness of NATO, the fragility of the Western economy, and the limits of American influence. It was a tragedy of hubris, a classic Greek drama played out with cruise missiles and drone strikes. The West, intoxicated by its own rhetoric, walked into the thresher, believing it could dictate the laws of history. But history, as Todd reminds us, is a ruthless teacher, and the lesson of Ukraine is being written in blood. You cannot fight a real war with a virtual economy, and you cannot lead a world that no longer fears you. The trap is closed, and there is no way out but through the painful realization that the old world is gone forever. The dust of Ukraine had barely settled on the front lines when a new, terrifying geometry began to take shape on the world map. For centuries, Western strategists had been haunted by a single nightmare, a theoretical monster sketched out by British geographers like Halford Mackinder. They called it the World Island, the vast contiguous landmass of Eurasia. The theory was simple and chilling. Whoever controls the World Island controls the world. For generations, the primary goal of Anglo-American foreign policy was to keep this landmass fractured, to ensure that the bear, the dragon, and the lion never hunted in the same pack. But in their blind arrogance, the West has accomplished the very thing they spent 100 years trying to prevent. They have forged the ring that binds them. It is not an alliance born of affection or shared ideology. There are no soaring speeches about brotherhood or the destiny of man. This is a cold, hard marriage of necessity, a coalition of the unwilling pushed together by the relentless pressure of Western hegemony. Russia, China, Iran, and a constellation of smaller states found themselves staring down the barrel of the same gun, the weaponized dollar, the sanctions regimes, the moral lecturing of Washington. They realized, with the clarity of survival instinct, that they could either hang separately or stand together. And so, the others began to coalesce. It was a silent, steady alignment happening in the quiet back rooms of summits and the encrypted channels of diplomatic cables. Pipelines were rerouted. Trade agreements were signed in local currencies, and military drills began to synchronize. The emerging Eurasian bloc is a fortress designed to withstand the siege of the oceanic powers. It is a self-sufficient organism, possessing everything a civilization needs to survive the end of the world. The energy of Russia, the manufacturing might of China, the young populations of Central Asia, and the strategic geography of Iran. While the West obsessed over software and services, these nations were securing the hardware of reality. They were building the roads, the rails, and the ports that would stitch the continent together into a seamless economic web. From the banks of the Volga to the delta of the Yangtze, a new nervous system was growing, bypassing the choked arteries of Western finance. The West had weaponized the SWIFT banking system, thinking it was a leash. Instead, they discovered it was a pair of scissors, and they had just cut themselves off from the majority of the human race. This coalescence feels like the tectonic plates of history grinding together. It is slow, deep, and unstoppable. The West watched with a mix of denial and horror as their divide and conquer strategy imploded. They had hoped to peel China away from Russia. Instead, they drove them into a no-limits partnership. They tried to isolate Iran. Instead, they pushed it into the center of a new trade corridor. The others are no longer asking for permission to sit at the table. They are building their own table, and the West is not invited. This is the rise of the rest, a revolt against the centuries-old assumption that the Atlantic Ocean is the center of the universe. The suspense in this chapter comes from the sheer scale of the shift. We are witnessing the end of the Columbian epoch, the era of sea power dominance that began when European ships first sailed to the Americas. The pendulum is swinging back to the land, to the heartland of the world. The world island is uniting, turning its back on the seas and looking inward to its own vast resources. It is a geopolitical fortress that the West cannot sanction, cannot blockade, and cannot invade. The oceanic powers, the United States and Great Britain, are being locked out, left to patrol the periphery of a castle that has raised its drawbridge. The nightmare of the British Empire has come true. The heartland is awake, it is united, and it is armed. The West is no longer the warden of the world. It is becoming the island castaway, watching from the shore as the mainland sails away into a future it cannot control. The most effective prisons are the ones you build for yourself, believing all the while that you are locking everyone else out. For years, the Western media machine has pumped out a relentless drumbeat. Russia is isolated. The world stands with Ukraine. The international community condemns the aggression. It was a comforting mantra, a way to reassure the citizens of the golden billion that they were still the moral and political center of gravity. But Emmanuel Todd looks at the map, then looks at the votes in the United Nations, and finally looks at the flow of oil tankers on the high seas. He sees a picture that contradicts every headline in the New York Times. The isolation is real, he argues, but the prisoner is not who you think it is. The West has inadvertently constructed a solitary confinement cell for itself. When Washington and Brussels blew the whistle for a global crusade against Russia, they expected the world to snap to attention as it had for the last 70 years. They expected the global South, the vast, chaotic rising tide of humanity in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, to fall in line, sacrifice their economies, and join the blockade. Instead, they were met with a stunning, deafening silence. Brazil, India, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, nation after nation looked at the sanctions regime and politely but firmly said no. They refused to cut ties with Moscow. They refused to stop buying Russian grain and fertilizer. They refused to treat a European border dispute as a global holy war. This refusal was not just about economics. It was a quiet rebellion, a declaration of independence from the Western narrative. For decades, the international community was just a euphemism for the West and its friends. But now, the mask has slipped. Todd points out the claustrophobic reality. The West represents barely 15% of the global population. The other 85% are watching the spectacle of Western self-destruction with a mixture of pity and opportunism. They see the hypocrisy of nations that invaded Iraq and Libya now preaching about the sanctity of borders. They see the weaponization of the dollar and realize that their own reserves are not safe. The trust is gone. The fear is gone. And without trust or fear, an empire is just a loud neighbor yelling at the clouds. The walls are not closing in on the Kremlin. They are closing in on the G7. We feel the shrinking of the Western world, the creeping realization that the garden is surrounded by a jungle that is no longer afraid of the gardener. The diplomatic summits of the West have become echo chambers where leaders congratulate each other on their unity while the rest of the world makes deals without them. The golden billion is discovering that it cannot eat its own financial services, and it cannot heat its homes with self-righteousness. They are trapped in a bubble of their own making, cut off from the resources and the vitality of the emerging world. Todd's inversion of the narrative is disorienting. It forces us to look in the mirror and see the pariah. The West is becoming an island in a political sense, drifting away from the mainland of human experience. We are the ones behind the blockade, sanctioning ourselves into irrelevance while the Eurasian landmass integrates and the global South rises. The psychological shock of this isolation is profound. It is the panic of the aristocrat who realizes the servants have locked the doors from the outside and are having a party in the courtyard. The West is alone in a room full of mirrors, terrified that the reflection staring back is no longer the master of the world, but a lonely, aging power shouting orders that no one intends to obey. We return now to the cold, hard numbers, the silent language that Emmanuel Todd speaks fluently. But this time, the spreadsheet is not labeled USSR 1976. It is labeled USA 2024. The data does not scream, it whispers. And what it whispers is a prognosis of terminal decline. Todd argues that the defeat heading for the United States is not military in the traditional sense. It will not come from a Chinese invasion fleet or a Russian nuclear strike. It will come from the implosion of the American soul. The empire is not being conquered, it is dissolving. The parallels are so precise they are terrifying. In the late Soviet Union, the warning sign was infant mortality, the inability to protect the beginning of life. In the late American Empire, the warning sign is the death of despair, the willful ending of life by adults who have lost all hope. We examine the graphs of opioid overdoses, of suicides, of liver cirrhosis in young men. These are not just public health crises. They are the anthropological markers of a society that has lost its will to exist. When a population starts killing itself in record numbers, it is a vote of no confidence in the future more damning than any ballot box defeat. It is the biological equivalent of a nation raising the white flag. This internal collapse of authority manifests in the chaotic theater of American politics. The polarization we see, the hatred between red and blue, the paralysis of Congress, the violent rhetoric, is not the cause of the decline, but the symptom. It is the fever of a body fighting an infection it cannot name. The social contract, the invisible glue that holds a diverse nation together has dried up and cracked. There is no shared reality anymore, only competing tribes screaming over the ruins of the public square. Todd sees this as the Sovietization of the American mind, the retreat into private spheres, the cynicism toward all institutions, and the belief that everything is a lie. The external wars, the aircraft carriers patrolling the Taiwan Strait, the billions sent to Ukraine, these are the frantic distractions of a dying hegemony. They are the thrashing of a swimmer who knows he is drowning.
The political elites in Washington are desperate to focus on foreign enemies because looking in the mirror is too painful. They would rather fight a war on the other side of the world than face the fact that their own cities are decaying, their schools are failing, and their children are dying of fentanyl overdoses. The projection of power outward is inversely proportional to the cohesion inward. The more the empire cracks at home, the more aggressively it postures abroad. But gravity always wins. You cannot project power from a hollow core. Todd predicts that this internal rot will inevitably lead to a sudden catastrophic retraction of imperial reach. It happened to the British, it happened to the Soviets, and it will happen to the Americans. One day, the orders will come from Washington, and the world will simply shrug. Or worse, the orders won't come at all, because Washington will be too busy fighting itself. The anthropology of defeat is the study of how great powers die not with a bang, but with a whimper of exhaustion. The United States is currently walking the path of the suicide, and the tragedy is that it is too busy watching its enemies to notice the razor in its own hand. If the American story is a tragedy of violence and excess, the European story is a tragedy of quiet, melancholy submission. Emmanuel Todd paints the old continent not as a victim of aggression, but as a sleepwalker stepping off a ledge with a polite, frozen smile. Europe, the cradle of the Enlightenment, the birthplace of the modern state, has reduced itself to a geopolitical ghost. It has voluntarily surrendered its autonomy, becoming little more than a terrified protectorate of a failing American empire. The capitals that once dictated the fate of the world, Paris, Berlin, Rome, are now mere echo chambers for decisions made in Washington, repeating scripts that are actively destroying their own future. The suicide is economic, and it is being committed in broad daylight. For decades, European prosperity was built on a simple, rational formula. High-end German manufacturing powered by cheap, reliable Russian energy. It was a symbiotic relationship that kept the lights on in Bavaria and the gas flowing in Lombardy. But in a spasm of ideological purity, Europe severed this lifeline. They cut the arteries of trade with Eurasia, blowing up the bridges to the east in exchange for expensive, unreliable energy from across the Atlantic. Todd argues that this was not a strategic necessity, but an act of madness. Europe has deindustrialized itself to please an ally that is simultaneously exploiting it. We see the factories closing in the Ruhr Valley, the chemical plants idling in France, the slow, suffocating contraction of the middle class. There is a profound sense of betrayal here. The European elites, the technocrats in Brussels and the politicians in the national parliaments, have sacrificed their own populations on the altar of Atlanticism. They have chosen to be loyal vassals to a sinking ship
rather than captains of their own destiny. They speak of European sovereignty while dismantling the very economic basis of that sovereignty. They speak of values while their citizens struggle to pay heating bills. It is a betrayal of the social contract that dates back to the post-war miracle. The promise of Europe was peace and prosperity. The reality is inflation and irrelevance. The atmosphere in this chapter is heavy with the scent of fading glory. Walking through the streets of Paris or Berlin, one feels the weight of a history that has ended. The museums are full, the cafes are open, but the energy is gone. Europe has become a theme park for tourists, a beautiful, stagnant pond cut off from the river of history. The dynamic growth, the future, is happening elsewhere, in Asia, in the global south, in the places Europe used to rule. By tying its fate so completely to the United States, Europe has ensured that it will go down with the ship. When the American empire retracts, as Todd predicts it must, Europe will be left alone, cold, and poor, wondering why it burned its own house down to keep a distant neighbor warm. This is the conundrum. How did the most sophisticated, educated, and historically aware continent on Earth commit such a clumsy suicide? Todd suggests it is a failure of the intellect, a collapse of the critical spirit that once defined the European mind. The elites have forgotten how to think in terms of national interest. They only know how to obey the logic of the bloc. They are sleepwalking into oblivion, clutching the hand of a protector who has long since stopped caring about their safety. The lights are flickering across the continent, and the tragedy is that the switch is on the wall, but no one has the courage to flip it back on. Europe is fading into the gray twilight of history, a cautionary tale of what happens when a civilization forgets that its first duty is to survive. The final chapter of this saga does not end with a bang nor with a whimper, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of a page. We stand on the precipice of a new reality, looking out at a horizon that is no longer dominated by the stars and stripes. Emmanuel Todd, the man who saw the death of one world in the birth charts of Soviet infants, now sketches the shape of the world to come. It is a future where the universal state, the dream of a single global liberal order, has finally dissolved into mist. The American empire, exhausted by its internal demons and overextended abroad, begins its long, painful retreat back to its own shores, leaving a vacuum that history rushes to fill. This new world is not a dark age, as the prophets of doom in the West would have us believe. It is simply a return to the messy, complex normality of human history. It is a multipolar world, a patchwork of sovereign nations and regional blocs, each playing by its own rules. We see the rise of a Eurasian century, anchored by the vast resources of Russia, the industrial might of China, and the rising ambition of India. It is a world where the center of gravity has shifted back to the world island, leaving the Atlantic powers as an important but no longer decisive periphery. The West will remain, of course, rich, culturally potent, but no longer the sheriff of the planet. We will have to learn to live as one among many, to negotiate rather than dictate, to listen rather than preach. There is a strange kind of hope in this vision. The collapse of hegemony means the return of diversity.
No longer forced to march to the beat of a single drummer, civilizations can breathe again. The end of history was a suffocating monoculture. The future is a wild, overgrown garden. Todd's prophecy is not one of apocalypse, but of correction. The fever breaks, the illusion shatters, and we wake up in the cold, clear light of morning. It will be a difficult transition, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But it is also an opportunity to rebuild our societies on foundations that are real, tangible, and human, rather than on the shifting sands of financial delusion and imperial arrogance. As we look back at the young historian in that grainy black and white photo, we realize that his work was never really about the Soviet Union, or the United States, or even Europe. It was about the truth. It was about the courage to look at the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. He taught us that the official narrative is often a mask for decay, and that the seeds of the future are always hidden in the overlooked details of the present. If he was right about the death of the Soviet Union, can we afford to bet our lives that he is wrong about the death of the West? The archives are open, the numbers are speaking, and the story of the next century is already being written by those who are brave enough to read them.
This narrative is far from over, and the pieces of the puzzle are scattered across history. If you want to understand the full picture of this geopolitical shift, you need to see where the cracks began. Watch the other videos in this series to trace the fault lines from the fall of Berlin to the rise of the global South. But more importantly, look around you. Do you see the signs Todd describes? Do you feel the shift in the air? Write your opinion in the comments below. History is not a spectator sport, and your perspective is part of the record. And if this analysis opened your eyes even just a little, leave a like to help others find the signal in the noise. The world is changing. Don't blink.